And you kind of talk about what you've discovered in your when you've been looking into Roman crucifixion practices.
Some years ago, John Dominic Crossan wrote this highly controversial book, a biography of Jesus, in which he argued that Jesus was not given a decent burial, but that he was eaten by dogs.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
and when that came out, I thought, this is really too much. This is over the top. You've got to be kidding me. Jesus eaten by dogs? Come on. And I just thought it was completely ridiculous and spectacular, sensationalist. When I was writing this book, I thought, I really need to find out what Romans normally did with crucified victims. Mm-hmm. I was not inclined toward Crossan's view or anything. I just wanted to know what typically happened to crucified people. Mm-hmm. Well, the interesting thing is we don't have very many. We don't have any explicit descriptions of the act of crucifixion from any literary source. There's no literary source that tells us how they did it. Probably because everybody knew how they did it, because it was a common thing, and so nobody gave us a literary description of it.
Right.
What we do have are a number of references to the crucified victims. And I looked up every reference I could find in every Roman source, and the persistent refrain is that when people were crucified, they were left on the cross as part of the punishment. Mm-hmm. Even after they died, they were left on the cross for days, so their body would decompose on the cross and eaten by scavengers, as it turns out, although birds are mentioned more often than dogs. But the point was that the punishment was not simply the slow, humiliating, and tortuous death of crucifixion. The punishment also included the ravages wreaked on the body afterwards.
Okay.
Because everybody in the ancient world wanted a decent burial, and crucified victims were humiliated by not being allowed a decent burial, and so the punishment was supposed to extend beyond death. Part of the reason for that was that crucifixion was meant to be a disincentive for crime.
Yeah.
And so Romans wanted these bodies hanging on the crosses so people could see them, these dead corpses being ravaged on the crosses, because nobody wants that to happen to their bodies, and so it was a disincentive. And so this is the typical Roman practice for crucifixion.
I'd sure think twice about stealing something or breaking a law if I saw that.
Well, the Romans had a very different understanding of punishment from our understanding. Today, if in a capital punishment case, if they're going to execute somebody, they try. They obviously don't succeed, as we've seen in recent news, but they try to do it as painlessly and as privately as possible.
Right.
And the Romans had the opposite idea, that if you want to stop somebody from committing crimes, you just string them up in the public square and you torture them to death, and you leave them there for a few days, and then see how many people want to commit a crime.
Right.
Were there ever any exceptions to this? I mean, would people occasionally get a decent burial, or is that kind of the point here? Why would Jesus be the exception?
Well, yeah, you'd have to ask why Jesus would be the exception. We know of two situations in which very, very rare exceptions were made. One exception is not quite the same thing, but Josephus, who's our first-century Jewish historian, who is our source for a good deal of what was happening in first-century Palestine. He was an aristocratic Jew with enormous connections. I mean, he ended up being made a kind of court historian in the court of the Emperor Vespasian. So I mean, he was extremely upper crust elite. At one point during the War of the Jews around the year 70, there was a massive crucifixion, and 3 of his companions were being crucified, and he requested the general in charge of the crucifixions to take down these 3 while being crucified to show mercy on them, and they took them down, and one of them actually survived the crucifixion. So if somebody was very well connected, you could get an exception.
So not an itinerant preacher who is claiming to be the true king
from Galilee.
No, not for him.
Right,
no.
Exactly.
But if you were the richest man in Judea and the most powerful, then The other exception that we know about is an extremely rare case that is mentioned by Philo, the historian in Alexandria, Egypt. Philo says that there were occasions when a person who had been killed by crucifixion would be taken off the cross in honor of the emperor on the emperor's birthday. If a person happens to get crucified, the day before the emperor's birthday, and then he's dead, and the emperor's birthday, then as a show of kind of mercy in order to honor the emperor,
right,
they would take the body down. Philo doesn't say that happened all the time. He doesn't say, every once a year this happens. It's just that he says on occasion that happens.
Well, doesn't John record that, though, again, it's the latest gospel, doesn't John place this around Passover? And so could this, maybe they did remove Jesus' body in deference to those celebrating that holiday?
No, the Passover is a Jewish holiday. Mm-hmm. Philo is referring to the Roman emperor.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's not saying that any time there's a festival they take bodies down. He's referring specifically to in order to show that the Roman emperor is a merciful person on occasion, they'll occasionally take a body down during a birthday of the emperor. So it's not, like if there's some kind of local celebration, the Romans are going to say, "Oh, you're celebrating? Let's take the bodies down."
Yeah, and that would seem like an unusual move for Pilate to.
So once I saw that, in fact, the typical procedure was to leave somebody on the cross, and then the body would decompose somewhat, then they would throw him in a tomb, and presumably for the lower class people, they would just throw them in a common tomb. If they were wealthy people, they might allow their families to bury them. But it was only some days after crucifixion. And so the question is, if that's typically what happened with a crucified person, would Pontius Pilate have made exceptions to the rule? So my next step was to look at what we know about Pontius Pilate. And what we know about Pontius Pilate suggests that he wouldn't have done anything like that. The only stories we have about Pontius Pilate show that he was absolutely ruthless and mean-spirited and didn't give a toss about Jewish sensibilities, especially their religious sensibilities. So the stories we have about him in Josephus and the comments we have about him in Philo show that in fact he wasn't somebody who was kind-hearted toward the people he was ruling. I doubt if he ever made an exception, and I can't think of a single reason why he'd make an exception for Jesus in particular.
I guess couldn't someone argue that because of the Passover week, you have a lot of the Jews coming to town, and you have a population swell to the point where it's very difficult to maintain order, perhaps. And if Jesus had a crowd of people following him, couldn't that maybe be a reason why they might make an exception just to kind of keep the peace in this very bloated population at the time?
I think if he was going to make an exception, what he would have done is not have him crucified while the crowds were there.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess you're right.
Be an easier way to avoid that. Yep.
He's being crucified in public, and so I think if he was afraid of that, then he simply would have waited till the Passover was over, then crucified him.